The document that arrived in Ambassador Yale Davin Osai's secure channel at 3:47 station time carried no preamble, no diplomatic cushioning, no acknowledgement of the 18 months of negotiation that had preceded it. It simply stated, in the clinical language of conclave administrative code, that humanity was required to surrender its arsenal within 60 days or face collective sanction. Yale read it 3 times. Then she did something that confused the conclave observer stationed outside her door. She laughed. Not loudly, not bitterly, just a small, quiet exhale through her nose, like someone who had been told a joke they had heard before and still found faintly funny despite knowing the punchline. The observer, a mid-ranking Velhari diplomatic attaché named Sorn, logged the response as anomalous and filed it under Behavioral Category 7, Irrational Positivity in the Face of Crisis. He would later revise that categorization 4 separate times, each time reaching a conclusion that made him more uncomfortable than the last. What Sorn could not have known, what no conclave member knew, despite 3 years of observation, despite embedding cultural exchange officers in 7 human cities, despite running 17,000 hours of linguistic analysis on human media, was that Yale's laugh was not a reaction to the absurdity of the demand. It was recognition. She had seen this document before, not this specific one, but she had seen the shape of it. She understood immediately what it meant, not because she was smarter than the conclave or more experienced in galactic politics. She was 34 years old and had been a xenodiplomat for less than a decade. She understood it because she had grown up in a place where institutions made demands like this, and she knew, with the bone-deep certainty of someone who had watched it happen, exactly what came next. She just didn't know how bad it was going to get. That was the first thing no one understood. Yale Davin Osai was afraid. She was profoundly, quietly, carefully afraid from the moment she read that document to the last moment this account attempts to describe. The fear never left her. She simply didn't let it make her decisions. That distinction would take the conclave the better part of 2 years to even detect, let alone comprehend. The second thing no one understood was the arsenal itself. The conclave had spent considerable resources cataloging human weapons. They had good data on thermonuclear devices, kinetic platforms, electromagnetic disruption arrays, directed energy systems, chemical dispersal, biological containment breaches, and 17 other categories of what they classified as harm generation technology. They had mapped human military installations across Earth and the 4 colony systems with a precision that satisfied their strategic analysts. Supreme Executor Havath of the Conclave Security Directorate had presented the arsenal assessment to the full council with quiet confidence. Humanity had a great deal of dangerous material. It was primitive by conclave standards, crude, inelegant, unguided in its destructive philosophy, but it was dangerous in the way that uncontrolled fire is dangerous, not because it is sophisticated but because it does not discriminate. The demand was simple. Surrender all of it. Allow conclave inspectors to verify, catalog, and destroy. Accept a monitoring framework that would prevent rearmament. Agree to a mutual security doctrine that placed humanity's defense needs under conclave jurisdiction. Havath expected resistance. He expected outrage, probably, impassioned political speeches, perhaps a vote in the human legislative bodies that failed, then passed, then failed again. He expected the process to take 45 of the 60 allotted days. He expected some weapons to be hidden, which was why he had built in verification clauses. He did not expect what actually happened on day 3. Humanity agreed, not reluctantly, not with protests staged outside embassies, not with a vote that split their governing coalition and left diplomatic channels strained. The Secretary General of Earth's unified government issued a statement at 900 on day 3 that was notable primarily for its brevity. Humanity would comply. A working group had already been established. Conclave inspectors could begin arriving within the week. Sorn flagged this to Havath as unexpected but positive. Havath agreed. He upgraded his assessment of human political decision-making from volatile and unpredictable to coercible under sufficient institutional pressure. He filed that assessment on day 4. He would spend the next 2 years wishing he could retrieve it. The first inspection team arrived at the primary human military logistics facility outside what had once been called Cape Town on day 11. The facility director, a heavyset man named Commander Tobias Reyes, met them at the entrance with 2 assistants, a prepared inventory and coffee that he insisted on pouring personally. The team lead, an Ashari inspector named Velindra who had certified 17 disarmament agreements across 4 civilizations, found the coffee gesture either charming or suspicious and could not decide which. What she found inside was worse than either. The inventory was complete. It was also, she quickly realized, accurate. Their scanning equipment confirmed the declared quantities within acceptable variance. Humanity was not hiding things. Humanity was handing over exactly what it had said it would hand over. This should have been reassuring. It was not reassuring. Velindra spent 6 hours walking the facility, and she sent her first flag to Haveth early that evening. The flag read in its entirety, "The humans are complying completely. I am uncertain why this concerns me, requesting guidance." Haveth sent back a 2-word response, "Proceed normally." She did not feel normal. She felt the way she had felt once, years earlier, when she had arrived at a location where she expected to find something and found instead that it was already gone. Not removed. Not hidden. Simply gone as though it had never been there, and the absence itself was a kind of message she didn't know how to read. Tobias Reyes was helpful throughout the inspection. He answered questions before they were fully asked. He provided additional documentation proactively. When Velindra asked about a discrepancy in one manifest, a category of storage containers that appeared on an older inventory but not the current one, he nodded, apologized for the confusion, and explained that those had been decommissioned 18 months ago. She asked what decommissioned meant specifically. He thought about it for a moment. Then he said, with a mildness that somehow made it worse, "We decided they were more dangerous to keep than to give up." She filed that response under clarification needed and moved on. She did not return to it until much later, when she finally understood that it had been the most important thing anyone said to her during the entire inspection. By day 30, the conclave had collected the bulk of what its analysts had cataloged. The process was going smoothly. Too smoothly, according to Velindra, whose flags had grown increasingly frequent and increasingly difficult for Haveth to categorize. She was not reporting violations. She was reporting compliance so thorough it felt like a strategy. On day 31, she filed a flag that simply said, "I believe we are being misled, but I cannot identify the mechanism." Haveth authorized an expanded scan. Secondary sites, civilian facilities, anything within 2 kilometers of declared installations. The scans returned clean. On day 32, Yale Davin Osai requested a meeting with the Conclave Observer team. This was unusual. The diplomatic track and the inspection track were supposed to run separately. Yale wasn't supposed to be interacting with Velindra's team at all. Sorn granted the meeting as a courtesy and sat in to observe. Yale arrived with a single folder of physical documents, paper, which she knew the conclave representatives found culturally eccentric, and sat down across from Velindra. She did not open the folder immediately. Instead, she asked Velindra how the inspection was going. Velindra said it was going well. Yale nodded slowly, looking at the table. Then she said, "You've cataloged everything in our declared arsenal, everything we built, everything we bought, everything we stored." She paused. "Have you thought about what we didn't store?" The room went quiet in a way that Sorn would later describe as qualitatively different from ordinary silence. Yale opened the folder. Inside were documents that looked, on quick inspection, like standard decommissioning reports. Velindra reached for one, read the first page, and felt something cold settle into her chest. She read it again. She looked at Yale. "These are destruction records," she said. "Yes," Yale said. "For weapons that were never on your declared inventory." "Yes." "Why?" Velindra stopped. She thought carefully. "Why would you destroy weapons that you weren't required to declare?" Yale looked at her steadily. "Because they were too dangerous." Velindra stared at the folder, at the thickness of it. The folder that represented, she was beginning to understand, an entire shadow inventory, weapons developed and then deliberately destroyed, not because anyone demanded it, not because they were discovered, but because humans had decided that certain things should not exist. "How long," Velindra said very quietly, "has this been happening?" "Since the beginning," Yale said. "Since the first time we built something and looked at what we'd built and understood what it could do." There was a long silence. "Why are you telling us this?" Soren asked. Yale looked at him. Her expression was not triumphant. That was the thing Soren would remember most clearly, years later, when he tried to explain this moment to people who hadn't been in the room. She didn't look proud. She looked tired in a way that made her look much older than she was, and she looked like someone delivering news she had known she would eventually have to deliver, and had not been looking forward to. "Because," she said, "you asked us to surrender our arsenal, and we did, completely, and I need you to understand what that means." Neither Velindra nor Soren immediately understood. That understanding would take longer. It would come in stages. Each stage would feel worse than the one before. Haveth received Velindra's report on day 33. He read it twice, then called an emergency session of the Security Directorate, which was significant because he had not called an emergency session in 11 years. The Directorate read the report. Several of them asked Haveth to clarify what specifically was emergent about it. After all, humanity had complied. The arsenal was being surrendered. This was the outcome they had sought. Haveth tried to explain why the report disturbed him. He had difficulty articulating it precisely, which itself disturbed him, because he was not a man who typically had difficulty with precision. The problem, as best he could express it, was this. The Conclave had assessed humanity's arsenal and concluded that it represented humanity's maximum destructive capacity. The shadow destruction records suggested that there existed a category of human weapons that humans themselves had judged too destructive to maintain, and those weapons were already gone. Not surrendered, gone, destroyed on human initiative before any demand, years or decades before the Conclave even knew humanity existed. The Conclave had asked humanity to give up everything dangerous. Humanity had already given up everything it considered too dangerous to keep. What remained, what was being surrendered now, was what humanity had decided was an acceptable level of danger to live with. Haveth looked at his analysts. "What," he said slowly, "does that tell us about their assessment of acceptable?" The room had no good answer. The question that followed was worse. If humanity had been voluntarily destroying its most extreme weapons for decades, driven by its own judgment rather than external pressure, then what did humanity consider extreme? And what didn't it consider extreme? And what was the relationship between those categories and anything the Conclave had previously understood about human decision-making? The analysts produced 3 separate modeling frameworks over the next 6 days. All 3 collapsed under the weight of a single variable they couldn't resolve. They didn't know what humans were afraid of. They knew what humans built. They knew what humans used. They didn't know what humans had looked at and flinched from, because that knowledge had been deliberately removed from existence. They were trying to understand the shape of a mind, using only the parts the mind had chosen to retain. Yale was back on the diplomatic track by day 35, attending formal sessions with the Conclave's political delegation. She was navigating the surrender framework's final details, administrative language around the monitoring protocols, verification schedules, the specific boundaries of what Conclave oversight would cover. It was tedious, granular work. She did it with the same focused patience she had shown throughout. Her assistant on the diplomatic team was a young man named Dmitry Salev who had joined her staff 6 months earlier, fresh from his doctorate in xenopolitical theory. He was brilliant and nervous and occasionally said things in the wrong meetings. He also noticed things. He noticed, for instance, that every evening at approximately 19:30, Yale stopped whatever she was working on for exactly 20 minutes, sat quietly, and then returned to work as though nothing had happened. He asked her about it once. She said it was prayer, or the closest thing to it she had. She didn't belong to a formal tradition anymore. She had grown up attending a church with her grandmother and had kept a relationship with something she described only as the habit of stillness. She said it helped her not mistake urgency for emergency. Dmitri asked what the difference was. Urgency, she said, is when something demands your immediate attention. Emergency is when the thing demanding your attention is actually more important than the attention you're currently giving everything else. She picked up the document she'd been reviewing. Most of what the conclave thinks is an emergency is urgency. Most of what they've dismissed as background noise is the actual emergency. He thought about this for a long time. He thought about it specifically on day 41, when the conclave issued a secondary demand. The first demand had been for the arsenal. The second demand was for the doctrine. Specifically, the conclave's political delegation informed Yale that the surrender framework required humanity to formally disavow its military strategic doctrine. All published and classified military planning frameworks, all operational protocols, all institutional knowledge structures related to the development and deployment of weapons systems. The rationale was that a doctrine without weapons was still a doctrine, and a species with a disarmed body but an intact military mind remained a strategic concern. They wanted humanity to surrender not just what it had built but how it thought about building. Yale read the secondary demand. She did not laugh this time. She was very still for a long time. Dmitri, watching her, had the odd experience of feeling the silence in the room change quality, as though the air itself had received information it didn't know what to do with. Finally, she said, "They have no idea what they're asking for." Dmitri said, "Should we tell them?" She looked at him. "We're going to have to try." The meeting where Yale attempted to explain the problem to the conclave political delegation was recorded in full by 3 separate monitoring systems, analyzed by 2 independent conclave intelligence teams, and reviewed personally by Supreme Executor Havath, who watched it 4 times and became more disturbed with each viewing. She arrived alone. The conclave delegation was 7 members. She sat down, organized nothing, and said, "You're asking us to surrender our doctrine. I want to make sure you understand what our doctrine is." The delegation's senior representative, a senior Velhari Politico named Assessor Merck, said that they were confident they understood. "You're not," Yale said without hostility. "I'm not saying that to be rude. I'm saying it because if you understood it, you wouldn't have asked for it." Merck asked her to explain. She said, "Your strategic doctrines are institutional. They live in documents, in hierarchies, in formal structures. They can be extracted from those structures and destroyed. Our doctrine isn't like that." She paused. "Our doctrine is what you get when you take a species that has been at war with itself for its entire recorded history and ask it to formalize everything it's learned." Merck said that was precisely what made it dangerous. "That's what makes it inseparable," she said. "The things that make us dangerous and the things that make us human aren't different things. They come from the same place. You're not asking us to disarm a weapons program. You're asking us to perform a surgery on our own cognition that we don't have the tools to perform and that, even if we did, we couldn't guarantee would leave anything functional behind." There was a silence. "You're telling us," Merck said carefully, "that you cannot comply." "I'm telling you," Yale said, "that compliance would require us to become something we have no evidence is viable." She let that sit. "We gave you everything in our arsenal. We told you about everything we decided was too dangerous to keep. We are willing to submit to monitoring. We are willing to limit development. We are not able to stop being what we are, no more than you are." Assessor Merck spent the next 3 days consulting with the full conclave delegation before responding. During those 3 days, Velindra, who was still nominally on the inspection track but had been increasingly drawn into the broader strategic assessment, filed a report that reached Havath's desk at 2:15 on day 43. The report was brief. It said, "I believe I understand now what Commander Reyes meant when he said the decommissioned weapons were more dangerous to keep than to give up. I believe he meant it not as a statement about the weapons, but as a statement about themselves. They were afraid of what they would become if they had access to those tools. They removed the tools to protect themselves from their own capacity. They are asking us to trust that they are capable of that kind of judgment reliably. I'm not certain they are wrong to ask. I'm increasingly uncertain about the wisdom of this demand. Haveth read it at 2:15 and did not go back to sleep. By day 50, something had shifted in the negotiating environment that no one could quite identify but everyone could feel. The conclave delegation was responding more slowly. The translation sessions had become longer not because of linguistic difficulty, but because the conclave representatives were taking more time between statements, as though they were checking each thought before releasing it. Dimitri noted this to Yale. She said she had noticed it too. They're recalculating, she said. What are they recalculating? She was quiet for a moment. Whether they made a mistake. Dimitri asked which mistake. She looked at him in a way that communicated gently that she didn't mean a single specific mistake. She meant the whole architecture of the decision, the assumption structure underneath it, the picture of humanity that had justified the demand in the first place. They thought, she said slowly, that we were dangerous because of what we had. They wanted to reduce our danger by taking what we had away. She picked up her pen and turned it in her fingers. A habit Dimitri had learned meant she was constructing an argument. But we've been showing them for 50 days now that what we have and what we are aren't the same thing. And I think they're starting to wonder whether taking what we have actually made us safer or just changed the shape of the problem. Dimitri sat with this. Then he said, "Did it make them safer?" she said. "I don't know yet." That answer was more unsettling than a confident no would have been, and Dimitri spent the next several days not quite able to articulate why. He arrived at the understanding gradually. Yale's uncertainty was not a diplomat's hedge. It was a genuine acknowledgement that she did not know the answer. She was not certain that disarming humanity had made the situation more stable. She was working through the problem in real time, and the fact that she was still working through it at day 50 meant that the problem had more complexity than she had initially accounted for. That was when Dimitri began to be afraid. Not of the conclave. He had been vaguely afraid of the conclave since the initial demand, in the background way that a reasonable person is afraid of something that has demonstrably more immediate power than they do. His fear of the conclave was the fear of coercion. What he began to feel at day 50 was different. It was the fear of consequences, specifically, the fear that a chain of events had been set in motion that no one in this negotiation, human or conclave, fully understood, and that the end of the chain was not visible from where they were standing. He didn't mention this to Yale. He suspected she already knew. The answer to the secondary demand came on day 54. Assessor Merck arrived at the session with 2 additional conclave representatives and a document that the delegation presented as a modified framework. The modification was significant. The doctrine surrender requirement had been restructured. Rather than demanding the formal dismantling of human military thinking, the conclave would instead require a comprehensive disclosure, every classified doctrine, every strategic planning framework, every operational protocol made available for conclave review. They weren't asking humanity to destroy its strategic mind anymore. They were asking to see inside it. Yale read the modified framework. She read it very carefully. She asked for 20 minutes to review it with her team, which was granted. In the small side room where she and Dimitri sat with the document, Dimitri waited for her to speak. She said, "They think this is a compromise, isn't it? They think disclosure is less than surrender." She set the document down. "It isn't, it's different, it might be worse." "Worse how?" She looked at the document. "If they read our doctrine, all of it, classified and otherwise, they will see how we think about conflict. How we plan for it. How we have planned for every permutation of it we could imagine, including permutations involving the conclave." She paused. "We have been at war with ourselves for our entire history. We have planned for every version of every war. We planned for wars that never happened. We planned for wars against enemies that don't exist yet." She met Dimitri's eyes. "If they read our doctrine, they will see the full architecture of how human minds approach the problem of conflict. And that architecture is not going to reassure them," Dimitri said. "So we decline." "No," she said. "We agree." He stared at her. "They need to see it," she said quietly. That's what this entire situation requires. Not because it will make them feel better, it won't, but because the alternative is that they make decisions about us based on an incomplete picture, and an incomplete picture of humanity's strategic mind is more dangerous to everyone than a complete one. Even if the complete picture scares them, she gathered the document. Especially then. They returned to the session. Yale accepted the modified framework. Assessor Merck appeared relieved. He would revise that feeling. The disclosure took 11 days. Humanity's classified strategic doctrine ran to what, in converted conclave data units, amounted to an archive larger than most species' entire recorded histories. It included war plans, contingency scenarios, deterrence models, escalation frameworks, conflict termination strategies, and several categories that conclave analysts initially struggled to classify at all, documents devoted to what human strategists called worst case of worst case planning. Scenarios so extreme that reading them produced a response in conclave analysts that their medical systems logged as elevated stress hormones. Haveth personally reviewed the summary assessment. He read for 6 hours. At the end of 6 hours, he sat quietly for a while. Then he called Velindra. He asked her a single question. In your inspection, when Commander Reyes showed you the shadow destruction records, was there any indication of what categories those weapons fell into? Velindra said that the records had been deliberately vague about specifics. The humans had disclosed that the weapons existed and had been destroyed. They had not disclosed precisely what the weapons were. Haveth said, look at the Doctrine Archive, section what they call termination threshold analysis. Then tell me what you think the decommissioned weapons were for. Velindra spent 2 days in the Doctrine Archive. She emerged from the review process and filed a report that began with 3 sentences and then was followed by a long gap before she continued writing, as though she had needed to stop and collect herself. The 3 sentences, I believe I understand now. The weapons that humanity destroyed were not too dangerous to use. They were too dangerous to have, because having them changed the calculation of what was survivable. Humanity destroyed them not because it couldn't use them, but because it feared what it would become in a world where using them was an option. The report continued for several pages, but those were the sentences Haveth read most carefully. Those were the sentences that clarified with cold precision what the conclave had spent 65 days failing to understand. The arsenal humanity had surrendered was not humanity's maximum destructive capacity. It wasn't even close. The arsenal was what humanity had kept after repeatedly, voluntarily, across generations, choosing to destroy everything it judged as too fundamentally destabilizing to exist. The weapons in the shadow records were not edge cases. They were a category. And the Doctrine Archive made clear that this category had been identified, discussed, and eliminated not by government fiat, but by a continuous, generational process of collective self-limitation, driven by a species that understood, on a level so deep it had become cultural architecture, what it was capable of becoming. The conclave had demanded humanity surrender its arsenal, believing the arsenal was the measure of human danger. The arsenal was humanity's answer to its own danger. They had not taken humanity's weapons. They had taken humanity's restraints. Haveth called an emergency session of the full Conclave Security Council on day 67, 7 days past the compliance deadline, which had passed cleanly, which now felt less like a resolution and more like a door that had been quietly opened. He did not deliver a prepared statement. He sat down at the head of the council table and said, with a flatness that several council members later described as the most frightening thing they had ever heard from a composed official, "We have made a categorical error. I want to explain its dimensions before we discuss remediation." He explained. He did it carefully, precisely, without inflection. He explained the shadow destruction records. He explained the Doctrine Archive. He explained Velindra's finding. He explained what it meant that humanity's voluntary self-limitation had been built not into law but into culture, which meant it did not live in institutions that could be surveilled, but in the accumulated memory of a species that had watched what happened when that self-limitation failed. He explained that human history was not primarily a record of human violence. It was primarily a record of humans choosing not to be what they could have been. And every time they made that choice, they made it without external enforcement, without conclave oversight, without monitoring frameworks, driven purely by an internal calculus that balanced capability against consequence in a way that no other species the conclave had studied had ever developed naturally. He explained, finally, that the demand for arsenal surrender had been built on the assumption that humanity's danger lived in its weapons, that removing the weapons would reduce the danger, that the weapons were the thing to be concerned about. The weapons had been the thing that proved humanity was concerned about itself. The council was silent for a long time. Finally, one member asked, "What do we do?" Haveth looked at his hands. He said, "I don't know yet, but I believe the first thing we need to do is understand that we are not in the position we thought we were in. We thought we were managing a risk. We were actually observing a system, and we have interfered with it." Another member asked what the consequence of that interference was. Haveth said, "We don't know. That is the consequence." Yale received Haveth's formal communication on day 70. It was not an apology. The conclave did not do apologies in the formal diplomatic sense. It was a request for a new kind of conversation, framed as a request for human expertise on what the communication diplomatically called strategic cultural integration. She read it in her office. Dmitri watched her face as she read. He had learned over the previous months to read her stillness as a spectrum. There was productive stillness, which was the pen-turning thinking mode. There was difficult stillness, which was the 20-minute evening quiet. And there was a third kind he had only seen twice before, which was a complete absence of movement that meant she was processing something she hadn't prepared for. This was the third kind. He waited. Eventually she said, "They know." He asked what they knew. "Not everything," she said, "but enough to be frightened, and frightened in the right direction." She set the communication down. "That's actually more than I hoped for at this point." He asked what she had hoped for. She thought about it. "I hoped they'd ask the question. It took them longer than I wanted, but they're asking it." "What question?" She looked at him. She looked tired in the same way she had looked tired in that first meeting months ago when she'd handed Velindra the folder. Tired like someone who had been carrying weight for a long time and was not anywhere close to being done carrying it. "The right question," she said, "is not how do we manage human weapons. The right question is what does it mean that humans manage their own weapons, and what happens when you remove that management from them." Dmitri sat with this for a moment. Then he said very quietly, "Yale, what does happen?" She didn't answer immediately. She looked at the window. Outside, through the station glass, the stars were indifferent and very far away. "We spent centuries," she said finally, "building the capacity to destroy ourselves, and then we spent more centuries building the habit of not doing it. Those two things grew up together. You can't have one without the other. The capacity and the restraint are the same development. You don't get the restraint without the capacity because there's nothing to restrain." She paused. What the conclave did, what they thought was making the galaxy safer, was remove the capacity. "But the restraint is still there," she said, "all of it. 70,000 years of accumulated human self-knowledge about what we're capable of and what we have to stop ourselves from becoming." She turned from the window. "They left us with all the wisdom and none of the tools. Do you understand what I'm saying?" He did, slowly, starting to. He said, "They made us more dangerous. They made us unpredictable," she said, "which is worse." She picked up the communication. "And now they want to know how to fix it." She looked at the request for expertise, and then she set it down again. And she did the thing she always did at 1930, whether or not it was 1930. She sat still, and she was quiet, and she stayed that way for 20 minutes while Dmitri sat across the office, and for the first time in his life genuinely understood why she needed it. The new conversation began on day 80. Yale's first request to the conclave, presented before any other agenda item, was simple: return the arsenal. Not because humanity was demanding its weapons back. Because the conclave had removed a component of a system without understanding the system, and the safest thing they could do, for themselves, for humanity, for the framework they had been trying to construct, was to acknowledge the error and begin carefully restoring equilibrium. Haveth agreed within 48 hours. The council vote was not unanimous. Several members argued that returning the arsenal was tactically indefensible, that they had worked to disarm humanity precisely because they considered it dangerous, and that the new analysis didn't change the underlying risk profile. Havath's response was recorded and archived, and has been reviewed by every strategic analyst in the Conclave's member systems many times since. The underlying risk profile was never the arsenal. The underlying risk profile is a species that has spent its entire civilizational history developing tools of destruction and choosing, repeatedly and without external compulsion, not to fully use them. We did not reduce that risk by taking the tools. We destabilized the system that was managing it, returned the arsenal, and then, carefully, slowly, with as much patience as this council has ever applied to anything, we learned from them. The vote passed, the weapons went back, and the galaxy, slowly, with the particular discomfort of those who have discovered that their confident solution was actually their most dangerous move, began the longer, harder work of understanding what humanity actually was. What it was, as Yale would eventually write in a document that became one of the most discussed texts in conclave diplomatic history, was this: not the most powerful species, not the most advanced, not the most unified or the most rational or the most peaceful. Humanity was the species that had looked, again and again across its long and brutal history, into the full depth of its own capacity for destruction, and had chosen, not always cleanly, not always successfully, but persistently, generation after generation, at enormous cost, to build something else instead, not to become harmless, not to forget what it was capable of, but to carry that knowledge the way one carries a heavy thing over a long distance, with both hands, carefully, never setting it down, never letting it master the direction of travel. The arsenal they had surrendered was not their power. The arsenal they had surrendered was the evidence that they took their power seriously. The conclave had looked at the weapons and seen the danger. They had not looked at the silence underneath the weapons, the decades of deliberate destruction, the shadow records. The doctrine that spent more words on, when not to act, than on any other single subject. The habit of stillness. The 20 minutes every evening that one tired diplomat spent sitting quietly with the weight of what her species was capable of, so that the weight never became something she stopped feeling. Havath said it in the end, at a closed session of the Security Council 2 years after the demand was first issued, when a junior council member asked him what the most important thing he had learned was. He said, "I learned that, when a species voluntarily limits itself, the limit is not the interesting thing. The interesting thing is what the species understands that makes it choose the limit." He was quiet for a moment. Humanity understood something about itself that we did not understand about them, and we made the mistake of treating the understanding as a threat instead of asking what they understood. We are still learning to ask the right question. The junior council member asked what the right question was. Havath looked at the table for a long time. "The right question," he said, "is not what are humans willing to do. We know the answer to that. The answer is almost anything under the right conditions. The right question is, what are humans willing to stop themselves from doing? And the answer to that question is something I am not certain we have fully measured yet. I'm not certain it can be fully measured. Every time I think I understand the boundary, I find evidence that the boundary goes further." He paused. "That," he said quietly, "is why we will never make this mistake again." Yale Davin Os retired from the diplomatic service 4 years after the demand. She was 38. She went home to a city that still bore scars from the kinds of conflicts that had made the shadow destruction records necessary in the first place, and she worked there for the rest of her life, in a small organization that did the unglamorous, specific, day-by-day work of preventing small violences from becoming large ones. She never wrote publicly about the negotiations. She told Dmitri once, when he visited years later, that she didn't think what had happened was a story about humanity's strength. He asked what she thought it was a story about. She was quiet for a while. Then she said, "It's a story about what you have to know about yourself to be trusted with what you're capable of." Dmitri drove home from that visit thinking about her words for the entire 3-hour journey. He thought about the folder, the shadow records, the weapons destroyed not by enemies or inspectors or governments but by humans themselves, looking at what they had built and deciding it should not exist. He thought about the doctrine archive and the thousands of pages devoted to the question of when not to act. He thought about the 20 minutes of stillness. He thought, finally, about what it meant that the galaxy had looked at all of that, the entire weight of human self-knowledge, and seen only the weapons. And what it meant that the weapons had been the least of it all along. The stars outside his windshield were the same stars the Conclave watched from. They burned without knowing they burned. They had no capacity for restraint because they had no capacity for choice. They simply were what they were, converting mass to light until there was nothing left to convert, magnificent and indifferent and entirely without the particular burden of knowing what they could do. Humanity was something else. Humanity knew. Had always known, built the knowledge into its stories and its silences, and its quiet daily choices and its shadow records and its 20-minute habits of stillness in borrowed offices on alien stations, with the weight of the galaxy watching and waiting to see what humans would do next. And what humans did, what they kept doing through every century and crisis and demand and mistake and correction, was something no purely logical species had ever evolved to do, and something the galaxy was only beginning slowly at great cost to recognize as the most dangerous thing about them. They chose. Not always wisely, not always in time, not always without loss, but they chose, and they kept choosing. And the choosing never stopped, even when everything said it should, even when the rational answer was to stop, even when the cost of continuing was higher than any external authority would have required them to pay. They were not the strongest species in the galaxy. They were not the oldest or the wisest or the most powerful. They were the species that had looked at the full depth of what they were and decided, every generation at whatever cost, to try to be something worth continuing. And every civilization that had ever tried to decide for them what that meant had eventually, quietly, in the private language of their own strategic assessments and sleepless nights, and revised classifications and carefully worded apologies, arrived at the same conclusion. They had misread the danger entirely. The danger was never what humans would do. The danger, the thing that woke Havath at 2:15 and kept Velindra staring at destruction records, was the possibility that someday, for some reason, humans might stop choosing. And no one, not the Conclave, not the human diplomats themselves, not Yale Davin Os, sitting quietly for 20 minutes at the end of another impossible day, knew what would be left if that happened.